Jeff Wilhelm, Jim Fredrickson, and I wrote a set of books about teaching writing and reading to meet and even exceed the Common Core state standards in narrative, in informational text, and in argument. And while there are different activities that we suggest for each of those kinds of writing, the books are united by our belief that effective curricula are built around developing 5 kinds of knowledge through 5 kinds of composing. The 5 kinds of knowledge we think that writers need are declarative knowledge of substance, that is, knowing the stuff about which to write; declarative knowledge of form, that is, knowing the formal features of the writing that you're trying to produce. And we think schools are pretty good at developing that kind of declarative knowledge. Think, for example, of a literature class where you spend a lot of time talking about a particular text, and then the teacher asks you to write about that text. The teacher is counting on your declarative knowledge of substance to be able to help you do the writing. That is, if you know the text, you'll certainly be able to write about it. Declarative knowledge of forms, schools tend to develop either through the study of grammar or through the study of models. That is, if you know what you're supposed to write, that you'll be able to write it. But we don't think that declarative knowledge of substance or declarative knowledge of form is enough. So we have to think about other kinds of knowledge. First, we have to think about procedural knowledge. That is, procedural knowledge of substance, that is, how do you find the stuff about which to write? So, for example, as an educational researcher, I have to design studies before I can write about it. I have to figure out how to get the stuff that I'm going to then put into my writing. Procedural knowledge of form is how to produce the formal features of the writing I'm trying to do. So, and here I think I know a lot about how to write what goes into a story. I know what the elements of a story are, but I've never successfully written a story because I can't put what I know into practice. And finally, we understand that all of the writing that one does is situated in a context, an immediate context, that is your relationship to the audience for whom you're writing, and a larger sort of more cultural context, that is, if I'm writing about, Jeff and I wrote a book about boys and literacy, we had to understand that how politicized the boy-girl debate in school was if we were going to be effective there. So those are the 5 kinds of knowledge that we think about. And we think that the way to develop that kind of knowledge is through 5 kinds of composing. Now, typically in schools, we think that schools move by assigning writing for students to do, and then engaging them in doing drafting and polishing those drafts in some fashion or another. And that's hugely important, to write a lot and to revise a lot to polish that writing. But that first draft composing and final draft composing, in our judgment, are only 2 kinds of composing that one can use. I think the biggest difference between what Jeff and Jim and I are arguing for and what characterizes school is what we call composing to practice. That is, we think that kids need to spend lots and lots of time practicing the kind of thinking and writing that we want them to do before we ask them to put it in practice in their drafting. Think, for example, about, I'm a tennis player, and I've been having trouble with my serve lately. So rather than go right out and play a match, what I need to do is work on, especially my toss, to get it down. I need to practice that, without the distraction of the whole game. I need to work on my serve. I need to practice. As teachers, I don't think we give our kids that kind of targeted practice enough. So one of the things we think about then is we talk about in the books, is how to develop effective composing to practice that's targeted to developing particular kinds of knowledge. Another kind of knowledge of composing that we think is typically neglected in schools is composing to plan. Composing to plan means articulating our purpose. It might mean, for a researcher, it might mean composing an experiment or figuring out a study. It might mean doing some sort of listing or brainstorming of that sort. So we need to give kids practice in composing to plan. And finally, we need to give students practice composing to transfer. So here's the deal. I think that most of us writing teachers pretend that the paper our kids are working on is the last paper they're ever going to write, and it's the paper that determines whether or not they're going to get into heaven. But the truth is, no single piece of writing, with a possible exception of college application essays, that we're helping our kids with matters. What matters is that we teach them something to prepare them to do the kind of writing that they're going to have to do on the job or in school or in their lives tomorrow and the next day and the next week and the next month. So we need to help our kids compose to transfer. And we think composing to transfer requires being able to articulate what it is you're doing. So a quick analogy. So I drive a Subaru Outback. If you drive a Subaru Forester and toss me the keys, I can go and drive your car without even thinking about it. The transfer happens automatically. But if you toss me the keys to a 72-passenger bus, the transfer doesn't happen automatically. In order for me to be able to drive that bus effectively, I have to say out loud to myself what it is I do when I drive. So I might say, okay, what do you do first? Check the mirrors. So that's what I would do. What do you do next? You would go through articulating the process that you go through as a driver will help you drive the unfamiliar vehicle. So too with the kind of writing that you do. If we're asking kids to transfer, if you're going to transfer something to a new situation, you have to be able to name what it is you do. So we talk in the book, we talk about how to foster develop composing to transfer so that our students have articulated understanding of how the kinds of knowledge they employed and the way that they employed them, the kinds of composing that helped them the most, the kinds of composing that helped them the least. What we hope our books do is help teachers look at their curricula in more useful ways. So when I was teaching, I planned day by day, and each of those days I thought about an episode. And that kind of planning is very, very difficult, and it takes a real lot of time if you're thinking about those kinds of shorter units. Well, we hope that the 5 kinds of knowledge and 5 kinds of composing heuristic does is let us look at larger hunks of time to see whether across a week or a couple of weeks we've engaged kids in all 5 kinds of composing, to make sure before we ask them, to make sure that in every unit that we do, we go through this, the help students develop on a number of occasions the 5 kinds of knowledge that we think that people need to be effective writers. So we hope that you find the heuristic valuable. We sure have in our teaching.